So I'm going to read a bio to introduce Reuben Silberman, but I want to first say that he really brings a kind of a soulfulness and neshama to all that he does. And we're so looking forward to his leadership as the new Vice President of Worship and Spirituality here at Bethel. And I've really, really enjoyed getting to know you and your family over the years. Okay, so here's the bio. It's a good one. Reuben Silberman grew up in and around Washington, D.C. As a child, his family belonged to Addis Israel in Cleveland Park and then Kemp Mill in Silver Spring. Reuben earned a degree in mathematics at Yale University and an MFA in creative writing from WashU in St. Louis. He spent a few years studying and working in Israel and has taught math at JDS at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School since 2003, where he's now the high school department chair. Reuben enjoys basketball, poetry, sad girl indie rock, and scary movies. He and his wife, Laura, live in Kensington with their daughters, Ellie and Sasha. We're really looking forward to hearing your words of Torah this morning.
Thank you, everyone. I just started my stint on the board, and my responsibility is to think about ways that we can enrich the shul spiritually and have more meaningful and authentic spiritual experiences. So if anyone has any thoughts about that, please let me know. My initial thought is we're just going to have the Edelsteins back every week to redo that baby naming, which is one of the more beautiful things I've seen here at the shul. Sorry if I offended you, Mara. Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. How do we see ourselves through the eyes of others? This week's Torah portion is Balak. Parshat Balak does what it says on the tin. It tells the story of the Moabite king Balak, not a Jew. Balak is frightened by the approach of the Israelites, who have, with God's help, defeated many other strong nations. The Moabite king sends messengers to hire an infamous sorcerer named Balaam, likewise not a Jew, to curse the Israelites so that they do not add Moab to their winning streak. I have to pause here because an urgent matter has already arisen. How are we supposed to keep straight the names Balak and Balaam, which sounds so similar as to feel punitive? My suggestion is as follows. Balak ends with a ka for king. Balak is the king. Balaam ends it in for magician, I guess. Additionally, I will always endeavor to clarify who is who in the course of this sermon. Not all heroes wear capes. Back to the story. Balak the king has summoned Balaam the magician to come and, do a curse. I assume that's the hand motions. I'm sorry if I just cursed you all. Balaam is not excited about standing against the Israelites and their all-powerful God. Despite this deep reticence, a stubborn talking donkey and an angel standing in his path, the sorcerer does arrive to meet with the king. Multiple times, Balaam ascends to a hilltop overlooking the Israelites. Each time, however, he consults with Hashem, and when he speaks, what comes out is blessings instead of curses. The most famous of these blessings, which Chazan Lubin so beautifully sang for us, opens our daily prayer and is likely familiar to most people here. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. How lovely are your tents, Jacob, your encampments, O Israel. The Ma tovu is the only part of our liturgy that was canonically written by a non-Jew. And it comes from a Parsha that features almost no Jewish characters, at least not until the last few verses, which makes this a great time to ask, how do we see ourselves through the eyes of others? Before we understand how we are seen, I think we have to clarify how we see the others. The Parshat, or surface-level meaning of this story, casts King Balak as the villain and sorcerer Balaam as the hero. As soon as the king's messengers arrive, Balaam consults with Hashem and establishes a red line. He will not disobey the Jewish God. He repeats this principle many times throughout the narrative and ultimately composes, or at least serves as the mouthpiece for, beautiful blessings, including the one that starts our prayers each morning. However, the Talmudic rabbis pretty eagerly reject the literal meaning of this parsha, in which King Balak is the villain and Balaam the sorcerer is the reluctant hero. Tractate Sanhedrin in the Talmud has an extended conversation about our two confusingly named lead characters. The king is treated much more briefly. In the story, Balak makes sacrificial offerings in the name of defeating Israel, but the rabbis explain that since these offerings have a superficial resemblance to Jewish ritual, they are actually praiseworthy, despite their ill intent. Here, the rabbis apply the concept of mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, performing a sacred ritual with no intention or even the exact wrong intention eventually leads one to have good intentions. King Balak, for some reason, could do no wrong in the eyes of the rabbis, when he clearly wanted to. The Talmud further explains that, as a result, the noble Moabite Ruth was a descendant of Balak, a lineage that continued forward to King David. So the rabbis were pretty forgiving of King Balak, who seems so clearly to be the antagonist of this story. They did not care for Balaam the sorcerer, on the other hand. The Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin spends a considerable word count reading between the lines of the biblical text to explain all the ways Balaam was terrible, actually. All his beautiful blessings were intended as curses. You know, why the rabbis apply the mitoch shelo lishma principle, that good actions lead to good intentions to the king, but not to the sorcerer, I have no idea. There's disparaging talk about a disability in one of Balaam's legs and blindness in one eye. And I'm not even going to get into their allegations about the donkey, which are thorough. You can go read the Talmud. On page 105b of Masechet Sanhedrin, a verse from Psalms is quoted. Ne'emanim pitzei ohev v'natarot nishikot soneh. Better are the wounds from a loved one than the kisses of an enemy. Rabbi Shmuel proceeds to compare the blessings of Balaam unfavorably with the curses of a character from the book of Kings 1 named Ahiah the Shilonite. Ahiah's curse includes the following line: V'hika Adonai et Yisrael kasher yanud hakaneh b'mayim. Hashem will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in water. Reeds are strong and resilient, explains Rabbi Shmuel, so between the lines of Ahiah's ostensible curse is a promise of Jewish survival. In Balaam's ostensible blessing, however, he compares Bnei Yisrael to an erez, or cedar, which does not stand in water and does not grow back when cut down. Balaam the sorcerer used a suboptimal vegetative metaphor for the Israelites. What dastardly villainy. I'm not sure what to do with all this. I read most of the articles about this parsha published on myjewishlearning.com, which I think gives me de facto rabbinical ordination, and I still don't understand why there's so much hate for Balaam the sorcerer. Many sermons I read attempt to explain what's going on here, and they all felt a little belabored to me. There's something regressive to my mind in the reading of sorcerer Balaam's perhaps fumbling and ambivalent good intentions as villainous, whereas King Balak's uncomplicated, unapologetic projection of strength, which is targeted towards cursing the Jews, is admired. This formulation makes me especially uneasy in our political moment. I don't have an explanation for the Talmud's reading. I'm going to have to sit in my unease. What I think is significant here to me is how any attempt to see ourselves through the eyes of others gets muddied by how we see the seers. Who watches the watchman, asked the turn of the last millennium Roman poet Juvenal. I do want to distinguish Juvenal from the turn of the current millennium poet Juvenile, whose odes encourage Bnei Israel and Yoshvei Tevel alike to back that thing up. You're a real fine woman, won't you back that thing up? Much more concisely answers the question of how we see ourselves through the eyes of others than I will in this sermon, but I digress. Before we can consider how outsiders view us through their side of the window, we need to contend with the cloudy glass through which we look out at them. We also need to keep in mind that any outside parties viewing the complex and restive nation of Israel have their own fraught dynamics and motives that are not always revealed to us or even to themselves. We sit still in the unease of what Balak and Balaam were really after. Questions around how we see ourselves being seen and the complications that arise as a result feel central to the experience of being a Jew in 2025. The realities of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and our perceptions of them inflect just about every conversation we have. Everything is passed through a double filter. How are we seen by others, and how do we see the seers? An elaborate framework for the act of being seen emerged from the 18th century English thinker Jeremy Bentham, who created the philosophy of utilitarianism. Bentham devised a thought experiment called the panopticon, which sounds to me like something out of one of those later sequels to The Matrix. The panopticon was to be a prison in which all the prisoners were perpetually observed by a single jailer, who was himself observed by the general public. Bentham's inspection principle suggested that if everyone is being observed and knows as much, criminals would be reformed and society's net output of moral behavior would increase. A number of panopticon prisons were actually built over the years, including 4 nasty-sounding compounds in Cuba in the 1920s and a digital panopticon in the Netherlands in 2006. I was scared to look too far into how that worked, but I would say that digital panopticon is a depressingly good description of how we live today. We curate our lives for public viewing online. Political and ethnic groups obsess over how outgroups see them. For better or for worse, the inspection principle shapes how we tell our stories and craft our sense of right and wrong. We don't need a panopticon built for us, we have built it ourselves. When possible, we should cut out the perceptive middleman. My colleague Tori Ball at JDS gave a lovely commencement speech a number of years ago, which centered on the famous 1979 Halloween candy study. The study looked at the effect of interventions on trick-or-treating children taking more candy than they were supposed to, a real societal scourge. One intervention that was shown to have a positive effect was placing a mirror behind the candy bowl. Kids who literally saw themselves were less likely to transgress and take more candy than instructed. We could benefit from less often asking how others see us, and more often working to see ourselves and our actions in a clear light. Last week I visited the Nova Festival exhibit along with a number of other Bethel members. I was and am dumbstruck by the stories told by survivors, family members, and first responders. The most direct and powerful experience I've had facing the tragedy of that day happened at the end of the exhibit, when I stopped and looked at all the pictures of the dead, just straightforward looking. Where I personally felt the most mediation in the exhibit was the passionate appeals to those journalists and organizations who insufficiently condemned the horrors. I know that sort of reckoning is important. I am working to understand this tragedy emotionally, and I personally am not ready to process that sort of looking at others looking back at us in this difficult context. I still need this simpler form of looking. As time passes, do what we once saw as blessings function as curses, and vice versa? This is certainly what happened in the time between the biblical story of Balak and Balaam and its interpretation by Talmudic scholars. Which of today's ostensible blessings are curses and curses blessings? I discern a Balaamist confounding of intentions in the ranks of non-Jewish nativists and messianists who so fervently bless the land, people, and government of Israel. Those are definitely the sorts of blessings that feel to me like curses. The question that is much harder for me to answer, and the one that will take more time before we are ready for a full Talmudic exegesis, is how do we see ourselves filtered through the range of criticism of Israel and its government? On the most basic pshat level, any criticism is a curse. I understand and quite often agree with the need to circle the wagons in the face of criticism from within and without, especially in a post-October 7th world. But when, or to what extent, do we see the curse of high expectations for the Jewish state as some sort of blessing? Are we a cedar, strong but brittle, or a reed in the water, shaken but resilient? Do the answers to these questions evolve as time passes? How much time? I think that our tradition's attempts to navigate how we see the Seers in this week's Parsha get lost in recrimination, strained readings, and conspiracy. I get no sense from the rabbinical response to Parshat Balak how we are meant to see ourselves. Instead of staring out the window and trying to figure out who is looking back and how, when can we do the honest work of seeing ourselves, like kids taking Halloween candy in front of a mirror? We need the tools to see when we are doing what's good and right and necessary, and when we are doing otherwise. We need our own blessings and our own curses. We really need to leave the donkey out of it. And when we are at a loss, we can always reappropriate the words of others. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. Thank you and Shabbat Shalom.